My great-grandfather was Thomas, or Tommy Millar, and he worked in Harland and Wolff shipyard as an engine fitter, and then he made a switch. He decided that he would become a seagoing engineer, so he joined the White Star Line, and he was given the position of assistant deck engineer. And I suppose what brought about that switch was the fact that his wife died very suddenly in early 1912, and he had two sons, and he wanted to give them a fresh start after the death of their mother. So he saw joining the White Star Line as a way of getting to America and starting over in New York City. His plan was still to work with the White Star Line, but just be based on the other side of the Atlantic rather than in Belfast. That seemed like a pretty good plan, but he heard then that the ship he was going to be crewing on was the Titanic. So that's where the story takes a different twist. Harland and Wolff was one of the biggest industries within the Greater Belfast, I suppose. There would have been, at the time that Titanic was being built, about 15,000 men, mostly men, working here. But I suppose the linen industry was really still the chief employer at that time. But the two worked side by side. You know, if linen hadn't have needed to be exported out of this city, there would be no shipyard here, because the need to bring big ships in to export that linen led to the recreation of the harbour at Belfast. And so the two kind of grew up side by side. But it was a shipbuilding town, absolutely. Harland and Wolff was the biggest shipbuilders in the world in terms of the tonnage that it produced. But in terms of employees, you're probably looking at the linen industry being slightly bigger. But then you have all the offshoots of the shipyard. You've got foundries and factories producing all the stuff that they actually need to operate. So it's bigger than those 15,000 men. It extends way, way out from that. But everybody knew somebody that worked in the shipyard. Everybody had a family member who had some connection to Harland and Wolff. My great-grandfather would have had a very long working day here in Harland and Wolff. He initially actually had come from a place called Bonnie before, which is about 12 miles from the city. That's where the Millar family's homestead was. And he was ambitious. He really wanted to make a name for himself in the world of engineering, which was so important in Belfast at that time. We had such flourishing industry here. So Tommy wanted a piece of that. And he got an apprenticeship with Harland and Wolff, which gave him a very thorough training across the board in all sorts of different trades. But he settled on engine fitting. That was his particular niche. So as well as working in Harland and Wolff, he would have been going to the technical college in town to learn the practicalities of it and the science of engineering. So he was on the up. You know, this wasn't a guy who was just out on the slipways hammering rivets into the ship. He was learning about the physics of what he was doing, and it took me a while to actually realize that. I'd always just thought that he was an ordinary worker, but he was much more than that. And I say that because he was a member of the Institute of Marine Engineers, so he must have known his stuff pretty well. But day to day, working in the shipyard, his day started at 6:30. So my grandfather remembers how his father used to leave the house. Tommy would leave about 6 in the morning and make his way by foot downhill and across the River Lagan to work, and with thousands of other men. And he would work until about 5:30 in the evening and then do the reverse of that journey. And when he came home in the evening, he used to talk to his children about what was going on here. And he spoke with great pride about the fact that he was helping to build the biggest ships in the world. And he name-checked Olympic and Titanic. You know, he was very adamant that the boys should know that he was involved in this most important of projects. So my grandfather's very clear memories of that. Tommy's job as an engine fitter, luckily for him, would have been mostly inside, because down at Harland and Wolff there would have been huge big engine sheds stretching for yards and yards and yards, which is where the huge big engine components would have been made and put together. The engines don't go into the ship until she's down at the fitting out wharf, but obviously you've got to construct them and have test beds for them and make the components individually. So he would have been in the heart of that with hundreds and thousands, probably thousands of other people. But yes, he would have been inside in those engine sheds working away on the engineering aspect of putting engines together. From what I know of what was going on in the shipyard at that time, it seemed to be the case that the White Star Line on site here, watching their ships being built, could occasionally poach some of the workers of Harland and Wolff. You know, if they saw somebody that they liked the look of and thought could be useful to their company, they would occasionally tap them on the shoulder and say, look, are you interested in coming to work for us? So if that was the way that they approached Tommy, it certainly suited his circumstances in early 1912. With the death of his wife and the yen, I suppose, to relocate to another country, he took advantage of that interest in what he had to offer. So the family story goes that he needed a reference to get him that job with White Star. Just to secure the position, he needed a reference. And although I have no documentary proof of it, the family story is that he went to Thomas Andrews to get that reference, and that Mr. Andrews wrote him a glowing report, which then sealed the deal. I'd love to have that piece of paper for sure, but it's definitely not around anywhere. When he started to work with White Star, it seems to have been a pretty quick process because, bear in mind, my great-grandmother died in mid-January of 1912, and Titanic was leaving Belfast by the 2nd of April 1912, and in between those two dates, he had done a run to Antwerp with the Red Star Line on a ship called Gothland. So, you know, maybe these approaches from White Star had been happening before his wife's death, and she hadn't been open to it. Maybe she was saying, no, I want you here at home. I don't want you out and away at sea. So it seems to have all happened so quickly that I think there might have been some overlap there. But anyway, yeah, Titanic was only his second voyage, and this was to be his chance to relocate. He was going one way, and he was going to be staying in New York after he left Belfast here. Tommy's story, from a personal level, is a very, very strong one, because when he left Belfast on Titanic, he had to leave his two young sons behind. The idea was that they would stay with relatives until he had established himself in New York City, and then he was going to come and bring them over, and they would have this fresh start in a new place. So just before he boarded Titanic, he took the two boys to one side, and he gave them each two 1912 pennies. And he said, don't spend those until we're all together again. Keep them until I get back or until we're reunited. So my grandfather was only 5 at this point, but he had very clear memories of being given these 2 coins and standing on the shores of Belfast Lough as Titanic departed with those pennies clutched in his hand really, really tightly. And he said he couldn't understand why everyone was cheering as the ship left, because for him it was such a sad moment. So anyway, as one of the crew of Titanic, Tommy would have had very little chance of surviving after the impact with the iceberg, and he was probably helping to get people onto lifeboats as he was up on the top deck. He didn't survive, obviously. When word got back to County Antrim that Tommy had not survived Titanic's disaster, my grandfather made the decision that he never would spend those 2 pennies, that they would be kept all of his life as a memory of his father, because he'd been told not to spend them until the family was all together again, and that was not going to happen. And so they've been passed down through the generations, and they came into my possession. When I would look at those 2 pennies today, I suppose it means to me that Tommy isn't forgotten. There are so many names, over 1,500 people lost in Titanic, and each of those people has a story. And we are incredibly lucky that Tommy's story has been preserved. It was preserved by my grandfather and then passed down by word of mouth and by written story through to today. So I suppose it's a sense of pride that my great-grandfather was involved in one of the most famous stories the world has ever heard, and that I can only assume he conducted himself with bravery. And it's just a sense of gratification that his story isn't forgotten and that he isn't forgotten. He was only 33, he had only started to live, and yet he's still being talked about here 100 and some years later. So yes, I guess it's pride and a sense of relief, I suppose, that the details of his story aren't forgotten, as they have been for so many of Titanic's victims.